Well, hello everybody, Mike here with Hardware Canucks, and our RTX 4070 coverage got a lot of folks talking about potential GPU upgrades for older systems. And let's be honest here, if you are rocking a GPU from 2016, so basically like the GTX 1070 generation and onwards, there are actually very few upgrade options available to you right now. There's of course the RTX 4070 that costs $600 and there's also the RX 6800 XT that's plunged down to around $500. And that $500 price point is an important number since when adjusted for inflation, that's about what folks paid for the GTX 1070 back when it hit store shelves. But remember, the 6800 XT is based off of the older RDNA 2 architecture, not the updated RDNA 3. And if rumors are right, it's not being replaced anytime soon. So this is what we're stuck with for now at least. And you know what? That 2-year-old, yes, 2-year-old GPU might cause some major problems for NVIDIA, especially at that price. But are either of these GPUs the right thing to upgrade to if you don't want to spend over $600 on a GPU upgrade? Well, look, people rocking an older CPU, motherboard, and especially power supply, well, they have a couple of other things to think about, especially when it comes to power consumption. That's because when it comes to earlier GPU generations, those had a lot lower power needs. Then things jumped with the RTX 3070 generation, and thankfully the RTX 4070 does take the foot off the pedal just a bit. But overlay the AMD cards onto this and it's pretty evident they've had a struggle in the performance per watt category, especially now with the RX 6800 XT that was envisioned as a much higher end GPU to begin with, lining up with the 4070. So while the RTX 4070 Founders Edition and a few of the more expensive custom cards use a 12-pin connector that needs to run off of a dual 8-pin adapter, there's plenty of options out there that have a single 8-pin, and that's sort of a big deal for people who might want to keep their perfectly good power supply but don't have the capacity to run a much higher end GPU. Meanwhile, every single 6800 XT uses a dual or even triple 8-pin connectors because of how it behaves from an efficiency standpoint. While it's technically rated for 220 watts, the RX 4070's overall power consumption is actually far below that. But overlay the RX 6800 XT onto this and it might be a deal breaker because on average it sucks back over 100 watts more in many situations. So people might end up needing a pretty substantial PSU upgrade right alongside their new GPU. Also, it's important to take note that increased power leads to more heat being dumped into your case, which is another thing you'll need to take into account when upgrading to something like the 6800 series.
Leave uncertainty behind for something that is guaranteed to last. The new P20 series grants unlimited upgrades with roomy insides, dual 360s, metal front mesh for good airflow, and 4 models to choose from. Check out and link down below.
And yes, I know a lot of people are going to be saying the exact same thing that I did too, and that is the fact that the RX 6950 XT has had its price slashed so much so lately that it falls right into the same category as the RTX 4070. But look, this brings a whole other level of performance into this price bracket, but only if it's used in an optimal situation, so with a current generation processor and a current generation system setup. But is it maybe too much for the system that we've set up here? And by too much, I mean that because it's so powerful, it might actually introduce a CPU bottleneck into this equation somewhere. But anyways, let's talk about that system a bit. It's basically an analog of what someone might still be using from a few years ago. It's got a 9700K and 32 gigs of memory, but you can use these results if you have an 8700K as well, since both CPUs were so close in performance. I'm also adding a 13700K into the mix with only the RTX 4070, and that should give you an indication of how things could look if you went full hog with a system update. For the GPUs, I'm using the Founders Edition of the RTX 4070, 3070, 2070 and GTX 1070, along with an RX 6800 XT reference card and a Sapphire RX 6950 XT Pulse OC. So its results might be just a little bit inflated over a reference design. And let me make this perfectly clear. This setup isn't meant to replicate a perfect situation where CPU bottlenecking isn't going to happen. That's because it's meant to represent what many people actually have. So earlier generation systems, which might not be the hottest things on the block in 2023. And they simply want to know if a drop-in GPU upgrade will be money well spent, or whether they'd be leaving performance on the proverbial table. So look, and I'm gonna look you straight in the face, and I really hope all the people who are gonna be commenting about this actually watch this part of the video. If not, I'm just gonna link to it in the comments below. You cannot and you should not be comparing the results that you're about to see in this video to all of the other reviews out there. So don't even try it. So anyways, look, with that out of the way, I really want to start with 1080p resolution because that is what most people are still likely using. And the story here is actually a hell of a lot more interesting than I thought it would be. The RX 6800 XT is able to match, or in some cases even beat, the RTX 4070 by a pretty clear margin. The only problem every now and then are those critical 99th percentile frame times, or what we call 1% lows, where the NVIDIA card just walks all over it. Either way, in the majority of games we tested, the RX 6950 XT installed into a system with an i7 9700K was actually able to outperform the RTX 4070 13700K combo. Let that sink in for a second. The 6950, when paired up with a half-decade-old CPU, was able to deliver equal or better performance than a platform upgrade, which costs you north of $750. Just keep taking note of those 1% lows though. And yet there are of course a bunch of titles that are obviously still completely CPU bound with this older system. And in those situations, it's probably better to focus on a full system update rather than expecting miracles from just a new GPU. I mean, sure, despite there being a hard ceiling on their frame rate benefits, the 6800 XT and 6950 XT would still net you massive frame rate jumps over something like the 1070 or 2070 or their Radeon equivalents. Moving on to 1440p, and the situation stays pretty much the same, but the 6950 XT is actually able to flex its muscles just a little bit more over the 4070 and 6800 XT, which makes its price premium all that much more justifiable at this resolution. A lot of that is due to the fact that at higher resolutions and ultra details, a lot more emphasis is put on the GPU throughput, so a weaker processor like the 9700X becomes all that much less of a bottleneck. That's why we see there being a lot less of a gap between the older CPU and the 13700K equipped system too. As a matter of fact, the 4070 and 6800 can be used pretty much interchangeably without huge differences in frame rates. But at the same time, while their average frame rates are impressive, there's still a complete failure by the AMD cards to deliver consistent 1% lows here. That's pretty worrying when you consider how important those are versus plain averages when it comes to how fluid a game actually feels. There are some exceptions to that though, especially where game-specific AMD optimizations tend to help things out. And of course, there's still going to be a few edge cases where the 9700K still caps overall performance even at higher resolutions. So now that we know where performance lines up, I wanted to dig into things a little bit deeper. And the first stop for that is trying to figure out whether or not, on this system at least, NVIDIA's software scheduler is sort of like stepping in to limit frame rates, or whether AMD's hardware scheduler is actually benefiting their cards in any way whatsoever. So at 1080p, let's put the RTX 4070's results here and figure anything with an average utilization of over 70% is likely getting into CPU limitation territory. But add the 6800 XT results to this, and there's definitely a trend. Normally, you'd expect situations where the RTX 4070 wins for it to have higher utilization numbers, because more frames generated means more data being pushed to the CPU. That didn't happen in every situation though. For example, the 6800 XT either matched or beat it in RDR2, Doom, God of War, and Warhammer 3, and yet its CPU usage was substantially lower. But don't go pointing fingers just yet, because in every one of those situations, you have to remember the RTX 4070 also had much better 1% lows too, and that technically would lead to a net increase in average CPU utilization. Meanwhile, like you saw, all the other results were neck and neck, so there's really no smoking gun here. But if I was willing to be a betting man and put some money on it, I would say that the actual effect of NVIDIA's software schedule is very much infinitesimal on a system with a 9700K. I mean, sure, there might be a couple of edge cases out there if you really go looking for them, but it's really not anything to worry about on a CPU that has 8 threads. Now, of course, as we go down the CPU stack to lower end CPUs, you might actually, and I say might, you might actually get into more and more situations where having a hardware schedule becomes more and more beneficial. But we're just not seeing it in the situation that we have right here. Anyways, let's see how the 6950 XT behaves by first removing the 6800 XT and adding that. And suddenly, we're seeing a lot more games running above the 70% mark, and that means it's smashing face first into a pretty major CPU limitation. Meanwhile, moving on to 1440p with the 6800 versus 4070, and of course the overall numbers do tend to go down since more emphasis is placed on the GPU, at least in most situations. But there are still some outliers here, like God of War on the 4070 and Horizon Zero Dawn on the AMD side, where the GPU that performs worse actually needs more CPU cycles. And the 6950 XT, yep, it's still pretty much maxing out the processor more often than not, even at this higher resolution. So obviously it still has a ton more gas in the tank if you ever want to go for a CPU upgrade. And yet, what that also means is that as a drop-in upgrade for a 9700K type system, you simply won't be getting the best bang for your buck. Not even close. Let's also talk about ray tracing performance with the RTX 4070 results, along with the RX 6950 XT and 6800 XT on top of that. In average frame rate situations, it's going to be sort of like a yin and yang story for the 6000 series cards. In COD and F1 2022, they're ultra competitive but tend to fall pretty far behind in things like Cyberpunk and Doom. Switch over to a focus on the 1% lows and the situation pretty much stays the same. Though the gap in Doom, well, that's narrowed quite a bit. The other thing you'll notice is while the 13700K system didn't benefit those averages, the opposite is true here. Meanwhile, the second batch of games is actually a bit worse for the RTX 4070. The 6950 XT with its older architecture is actually able to beat or nearly match it in 3 out of 4 games. Remember, I'm testing without any FSR or DLSS crutches here too. The situation changes again with the 1% lows, and here we actually see the CPU choice plays a significant role in Spider-Man and Far Cry 6. So while ray tracing is incredibly GPU intensive, there are definitely some games that benefit from a processor upgrade here too. Alright, so I know that was a ton of information to process in a relatively short amount of time. So let's do the simple thing here and distill all of that information from 14 games into some overall performance averages so we know what we're talking about here. If you're gaming at 1080p, the 6800 XT and 4070 are literally neck and neck and provide good increases for people rocking GPUs from the 1070 or even the 2070 generations. And based on the 13700K results, there's still quite a bit of CPU bottlenecking going on here too, especially for the 6950 XT, which has its performance seriously kneecapped if it's being used as a drop-in upgrade for this type of older system. But check this out. Everything pretty much turns on its head when we talk about those 1% lows, because the 6800 XT and 6950 XT end up falling behind. So in essence, this means the 4070 can deliver a more fluid gaming experience even when paired up with a 9700K. 1440p on the other hand, well, that allows all these GPUs to really stretch their legs over the previous generations. But the 4070 and 6800 XT still have pretty much the same performance, except of course those 1% lows where Nvidia still wins. And yes, the 6950 XT is still bottleneck too, but it's really showing where it shines. So I guess the question is, when it comes to a drop-in upgrade at this price level, what should you be looking at? The RX 6800 XT or the RTX 4070? And you know what? That really depends on what you're actually looking for. So the RX 6800 XT has comparably identical performance at a lower price point, but at the same time, it does consume a heck of a lot more power, it does dump more heat into your case, and if you care about ray tracing performance, it is going to fall behind quite a bit. On the other hand, you have a more expensive $600 GPU with less memory that's comparatively super efficient, dumps less heat into your case, has better RT performance, and superior upscaling with DLSS. And let's talk about the RX 6950 XT, because it has a ton more potential than the 4070, but at the same time, with an older processor, you're a lot more likely to run into a CPU bottleneck, even at higher resolutions. This actually makes it a perfect solution for people who might want to leapfrog upgrade. So what that means is upgrade the GPU now, knowing full well you have a ton of additional performance left in the tank when, not if, you upgrade the CPU. This situation though, well, it only works if you commit to a new processor at some point. Otherwise, you're leaving tons of performance on the table and are better off with a 4070 or 6800 XT. So with all that being said, I really hope this video helps a lot of people better understand where the RX 6800 XT, 6950 XT, and RTX 4070 land in relation to performance when it comes to a drop-in upgrade for an older system. Anyways, I'm Mike with Hardware Canucks. I hope that you enjoy content like this, and I will definitely see you in the next one. Have a good one, guys.